Future Hindsight. Why are local governments not living up to their potential? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport, tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. Local government is often held up as democracy at its most accessible, where regular people have the most power, where showing up can really make a difference. This is the theory, but in practice, does it live up to that ideal? And how can we invigorate our democracy at the local level? Our guest today is Brian Adams. He's professor of political science at San Diego State University and the author of Activism, Majority Rule, and Local Democracy, Rethinking Public Influence. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's easy and free, and it really goes a long way. Check us out at youtube.com/Future Hindsight. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So most people assume local democracy falls short simply because not enough residents show up. And while participation matters, more bodies in the room won't deliver the change we're looking for. And you argue that we've been diagnosing the wrong disease. Something deeper is broken. What is it?
It's not so much that something deeper is broken, but we've misunderstood how local democracy should work. So definitely we want people to be involved. It's great when people are going out and trying to influence their local government. But even if everybody were involved, it would be challenging because it wouldn't necessarily lead to policies that reflect majority preferences. And so in the book, I sort of frame it as activism versus majority rule, right? So when you think about, we want decisions to be made on a majoritarian basis, where we want policy to reflect majority preferences. Activists, though, aren't necessarily reflective of what the majority wants. And that's not just because they're few in number, but because of the way that we do activism and how people choose to participate on various issues. You get a situation where activists are often pushing for policy solutions that are very different than what the majority wants.
So you just said that you look at activism in the context of local democracy, and you went out and talked to local activists in San Diego who were trying or are trying to shape local policy. What did you discover about these activists?
So the people I interviewed were, in many ways, ideal democratic citizens. They were people who went out, they cared about their community, they cared about a particular issue, they went to the local government to try to get local government to address the issues that they were concerned about. They were all volunteers. None of them were paid. None of them were doing as part of their job. They were sacrificing a lot of their own time to make their communities better. And so they were engaging in the stuff we want everybody to engage in. But then when I thought, what if everybody did that, right? Suppose everybody were involved in their communities in that way. In one way, that would be great, but people can't be involved in every issue, right? I mean, you don't engage politics generally. You engage on specific issues. Now, the specific issues I was looking at were land use, transportation, housing, those sorts of issues. And on those issues, they attract a certain type of person, right? Not everybody's going to be interested in those issues. People may be more interested in education or healthcare or what's going on in the national government and not really caring about their local government. So the actual people who are engaged on the issues I was looking at, they were average people, but they weren't necessarily representative of what average people would actually want on that issue. And I think that's generally true across issues, right? Every issue is going to attract a group of participants, group of activists who care about that issue a lot. And because they care, because they're choosing that issue specifically, they're likely to be very different than sort of your average person that's not engaging on that issue. So you're going to have a lot of biases in who's involved. And the people involved in that issue may be pushing for policy solutions that the majority doesn't agree with.
Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, I would say, isn't this kind of the whole point of democracy, that this is the best way to sort more or less, meaning it's imperfect, right? This is an imperfect process and it will render imperfect results. And like you said, not everybody is going to be animated about the same issues, but I still think it's good for everybody to get involved in whatever issue that they're passionate about. I think the problem, as I was reading your book in many ways, is how to translate that into public policy that other people can also understand. So, for example, if I'm not passionate about, let's say, bike lanes, what do I need to know in order to understand the pros and cons of whatever policy that the activists are pushing for?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's all sorts of benefits to activism, right? I mean, it allows people to engage in self-governance, that they can influence the issues that they really care about, right? That's an essential part of democracy. Often, though, in political science and also more general public discussion, we assume that all issues need to be decided on a majoritarian basis. And if it's not, there's something wrong with the democratic system. And we often see activism as a way to enhance majority rule. The more people get involved, the more we're going to get policy that reflects majority preferences. And if we don't have policy that reflects what the majority wants, that means that we don't have enough people engaged in activism. And that's sort of what I'm arguing against here, is this idea that we should see activism as leading to majority rule. Activism is great. It has a lot of benefits to it. And some issues should be decided by activists, right? I would much prefer to have a thoughtful group of people who really care about an issue have an outsized influence on that issue than a majority that may not care much, may not really thought about it at all, and so forth. So we need to think about what issues need to be decided on a majoritarian basis and what issues should be decided by activists. And there are some types of issues where we do want them decided by majority rule, where we want them to reflect, whatever the majority preference happens to be. But there may be some other issues where it's okay that a group of unrepresentative activists have a tremendous amount of say over that issue, even though what they're pushing maybe isn't quite what the majority would prefer.
Right. So I have two follow-up questions to that. The first one is, if self-governance and this activism, to push for public policies that they think will benefit the public good and majoritarian outcomes, majority rule, are both cornerstones of democracy, and yet they're often at odds with each other, but not always, right? Not always. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that they're often at odds?
Activism and majority rule are often at odds because when people participate, they specialize on specific issues. And the people who are active on a given issue are unlikely to be representative of what the majority believes. For example, in one of the issues that the activists that I talked about were very involved with bike lanes. This was a big issue in San Diego. There are a lot of activists who really liked bike lanes. They want to promote active transportation. It's good for the environment and so forth. There are a lot of other people that were really opposed to them because they take away from parking and so forth. And so this was a very contentious debate. And both sides made reasonable arguments, and they were all average people, right? Elites weren't really involved with this at all. It was just sort of average people on both sides who had a particular vision of how they wanted the city to look. But both sides were not really representative of your average San Diegan. I mean, your average San Diegan doesn't really care all that much about bike lanes. They don't have really strong opinions. They maybe not even really given much thought to bike lanes and whether they're a good idea. We don't know exactly what they think because we don't have good survey research on that. But the activists were not like that, right? They had very strong opinions. Again, they were average people. They were good people. They were just trying to make their community better in how they saw it. But they weren't typical. And so because the activists had some sway over that issue and the bike lane activists went out, we have all these bike lanes now in San Diego, you may end up getting policy that's different with the majority actually wants. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, it's not bad that bike activists are able to get bike lanes because they care really passionately about it. They really are concerned about the issue and so forth. And so it's okay maybe if we didn't get a policy that reflects majority opinion because we're allowing the bike activists to engage in self-governance and they get some real benefits out of that. And I think society as a whole gets a benefit out of that as well.
I think we're saying something very similar in a sense that just because maybe the majority doesn't necessarily have an opinion doesn't mean it's not in the public interest to have bike lanes. Given some of these structural issues, I'm wondering about what kind of framework would solve both problems at once.
So if you think about, we have institutions that are designed to be majoritarian, right? For example, elections. Now, they don't always work this way, but the way they're supposed to work is that elections are going to lead to representatives who represent majority views. We have things like direct democracy, like ballot initiatives, which are majoritarian. And we have other types of institutions that can be designed to allow for majority opinion to influence policy. Then we have all sorts of other institutions that favor activism. Things like allowing people to speak at city council meetings, or making, having required public comment periods, or other sorts of things along those lines, which it makes it easier for activists to have a say in policy and so forth. And so what I argue in the book is we need to think about those and to think about balancing those in a way of where the issues where we want a majority to have sway, that they're able to do so. Whereas on other issues, we have more activist influence. I think for many democratic reformers, their default is that we need to make it easier for activists to participate. And there's all these efforts to try to make it easier for activists to participate. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's important to note that that won't necessarily lead to policy that's going to be more reflective of majority views.
Right. I want to return to something that I said earlier, that democracy won't render perfect outcomes, right? But I also believe that if we improve it consistently, we'll get better ones over time. And I also believe that democracy is in the pursuit of public interest. And you just said, who gets basically the final word when it comes to public policy? And so really what I'm wondering, though, is who determines, or how can we determine what is the public interest? Because I feel like that's maybe a better goal as opposed to like who is right and who is wrong at the end.
Yeah, that's a good question. In the end of the day, you have to have some sort of definitive process for deciding policy issues. And that has to be done through a vote, and therefore a majoritarian vote, right? Or perhaps a supermajority vote, right? So on contentious policy issues, when you have to make a decision, it has to be done on a majoritarian basis, right? So majority rule is sort of a final arbiter. And when you have a majority that actually cares about an issue, they have a defined belief about the issue, and they have knowledge about the issue to actually have a thoughtful view on it, then yeah, clearly we need to do that on a basis of a majoritarian basis. And ultimately, the majority is the one deciding what's in the public interest. But a lot of issues don't meet those criteria, where the majority isn't really paying much attention. They don't really care all that much. They don't have a defined belief on the issue. And on those issues, it's okay for activists to have sway. It's okay for elected officials to listen to those activists, right? One of the things that I heard a lot in my interviews is that the interviewees worked really, really hard to try to convince me that they were in the majority. They were representing average people, and that their opponents were somehow elites or not average or whatever, right? So you'd have people, for example, who were against more housing in central San Diego neighborhoods or against housing density. And they're like, well, we're just average people, and then we're against the YIMBY pro-housing people. They're all elites and the pocket developers or whatever. And then, of course, the YIMBYs, when I talked to them, they were like, oh, those, the anti-housing people, they're just these rich homeowners and they're elites and whatever. And it's like, it didn't really matter who was in the majority in that case. I mean, because most people aren't paying attention to whether there's more density in this particular street or this particular housing development that's proposed or whatnot. And it sort of distracted from the more important issue about whether it's a good idea to actually build more housing in this particular location. And of course, in that example, neither group of activists were really representative of the majority, right? They were all very different probably than what your average San Diegan thought about this issue. So on an issue like that, I think it's okay to let activists battle it out. And it's okay if the end result is a result of activism and not necessarily reflective of majority preferences.
Okay. So do these things come up in a referendum in San Diego, like the bike lanes and the housing density? Because the bike lanes in New York City are not up for referendum. I do not get to vote on that. So, when we say that the majority should have final say, I think often those elections aren't happening. How do you think about that?
Well, think about it from the perspective of an elected official, right? You're a city council member and you're deciding on whether to approve new housing developments. And there are activists on both sides. For some people, they say, well, what that city council member should do is say, what does the majority want? And I should vote based on the majority. The reality is they often don't do that. They often will, be influenced by activists. And I argue that's okay. It's okay for a city council member to say, I'm going to ignore what the majority actually believes, assuming they know what the majority believes, they may not. And I'm going to, side with this group of activists who either are for or against this housing because I find their arguments to be compelling and they really thought a lot about the issue, they really care about the issue and so forth. So one of the things that really struck me when I was doing the interviews with the activists is they were really knowledgeable about these issues, much more knowledgeable than your average San Diego, and in a lot of ways, much more knowledgeable than I was as a political scientist, because they spend all their time thinking about issues of density and Florida area ratios and all this other sort of stuff. And they have all this knowledge and they really care deeply. They have these really intense preferences. And in some ways, I think it's plausible to argue that because of that, they should carry greater weight. And that as an elected official, as a city council member or as a mayor, to look at that group and say, yeah, they may not be representative of the public as a whole, but they're fairly knowledgeable. They make really good arguments. They care very, very deeply about this issue. So I'm going to defer to their judgment on this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just going to put this out there again, that the public official is not actually going to conduct a vote with his or her constituents in their district to figure out what the majority actually wants. But in terms of the activists, they are super activated, as you say. They do a lot of research. They know a lot of stuff. Who are these activists? Are they all more or less grassroots people? Or what's your definition of activist?
Yeah, so as a condition for being included in my study is they couldn't be paid for their activism. So none of them worked for an activist organization. None of them were paid lobbyists or anything like that. So yeah, these were people who just cared about their community. They had a particular issue they really cared about, or they cared generally about community issues specifically. Many of them, they got asked to be involved at some point. They got pulled in through various community organizations. There's a specific development in their community they got really interested in, and they've stayed involved after that. These are people who sit on local community planning groups, which are advisory groups in San Diego. They're involved in local, neighborhood groups in one way or another. As most people engaged in politics, there were some biases. They were generally wealthier, generally better educated than your average San Diegan. And that's certainly true, in all types of political participation.
We'll be back with Brian in just a moment, so stick around. You'll have to hear this episode's Civic Spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, starting something new is hard, really hard sometimes, maybe even a little terrifying, if I say so myself. So much work goes into this thing that you're not entirely sure will even work out. And it can be tough to make that leap of faith. Trust me, I know. When I started Future Hindsight, I didn't totally know what I was doing. And those questions swirled around. What if no one listens? What if I make a fool of myself? I knew I had a mission, but those thoughts linger, whether you want them to or not. But now, I know I was right in believing in myself, despite any fears or hesitations. Of course, it can also help when you have a partner like Shopify on your side. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Aviator Nation to fresh brands that are just getting started. And Shopify is there for you too. Accelerate your efficiency whether you're uploading new products or trying to improve existing ones. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Now, you might be wondering, what if people haven't heard about my brand? It's okay. Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. So tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. Everything is all in one spot, making your life easier and your business operations smoother. What I love about Shopify is how no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. It's time to turn those what-ifs into cha-ching with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. That's shopify.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation with Bryan Adams. Well, we're talking about the tension between activism and majoritarianism, if there is, and not always. But we can say that every day people feel the effects of local government every single day, whether that's in our schools, our streets, our neighborhoods. And at the same time, so many residents feel frustrated that local government is not delivering. What are we getting wrong about local government not delivering?
Two responses to that. The first is that, for many people, they aren't involved in local communities because they actually are involved in other political issues, right? So you may have people that aren't involved in local politics because they care about what's going on in the national government or their state government, or they care really deeply about healthcare policy, and local governments have very little influence over that, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, that's perfectly reasonable to say, yeah, I'm affected by what my city council does, but what I really care about is healthcare policy. I'm going to focus all my attention on that. So I think for a lot of people, they recognize the importance of local government, even if they aren't involved, because they have other things they're involved in. So that's the first response. And the second response is, I think what we're getting wrong is that we're focused so much on whether local government is doing the bidding of what the majority wants, instead of focus on what are the best policies to actually address the problems that local governments are facing. So much of the conversations that I had with these activists wasn't about, here's why my argument is a good argument. Here's why my policy proposal is a good policy proposal. It's the other side is being funded by developers, or, these other activists are unrepresentative, or it's these sorts of political types of arguments that I think really distract from sort of the core issues about what should we do to solve our problems. And I think we need to get back to that, not focusing so much on who's participating, the demographics of who's participating, whether they represent the majority or not, or what the latest survey said about the majority thinks, or things like that. Just to focus on, okay, we've got a problem here. For example, in San Diego, we have a big housing problem. It's super expensive. How do we actually solve that problem? And I think that would really help the public discourse around local issues.
For sure, I agree there that we need to be centering solving the problem in order to deliver on the public interest. And I feel like when government fails to deliver there, democracy loses legitimacy in the eyes of everyday people. And we are seeing that also play out on the national level, of course. For example, waging war without congressional approval, right? So in your mind, what are the stakes of democracy losing legitimacy at the local level?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there is that loss of legitimacy at all levels of government. That's true for the local level as well. What ends up happening, I think, is that when local governments do make good decisions, there's still a lot of skepticism and inherent distrust of those decisions, even when they're doing the right thing, right? So when you have local governments that are making poor decisions and you lose that legitimacy, even when they start doing things right, they end up not being supported, or they end up being criticized and so forth. And ultimately, an essential part of democracy is you have to accept when you lose political battles. You fight your fight, and then if you don't win, you say, well, okay, I'll live to fight another day, and sort of argue for another issue, right? So in San Diego, the pro-housing faction has largely won out. The YIMBY pro-housing activists have generally been fairly successful at getting the city to allow for greater density of housing in central San Diego neighborhoods. So for the people who are opposed to that, the activists I interviewed, they need to be able to say, okay, well, we lost that battle. We'll go fight in the next battle. If government loses legitimacy, people may not say that. They may say, well, this isn't fair. This is fundamentally corrupt. This is wrong, and I'm not going to accept this outcome as being legitimate. And that really is harmful to democracy when people don't accept outcomes of political debates or, for that matter, elections. They don't accept them as legitimate. It really does undermine the very fabric of democracy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have a question here about participation and higher rates of participation, because, of course, we know that turnout in local elections hovers around 25%, 20 to 30%, depending on where you live, compared to, in good presidential years, over 60% voter participation. So I think it's fair to characterize the people who show up to local elections as having stronger, more activated views than the average resident. And there are many barriers to voting. Sometimes it's something like childcare. I'd want to make sure that it's not just one thing. So what is, though, the problem with the reality that local elections seem to only create accountability toward a small, almost unrepresentative slice of the population?
I think we have to keep separate elections with activism, right? When it comes to elections, the greater voter turnout you have, the better. And there are things we can do to try to increase voter turnout. For example, a lot of cities are now having elections at the same time as national elections, as we do in San Diego. And that increases turnout phenomenally. So that makes a big difference. There are other things you can do to sort of get people more involved. And that definitely is a real problem, is that if you've only got 30% of people turning out, they're a very, very biased group of people. They tend to be older, they tend to be wealthier, tend to be homeowners, and it really skews local policy in that way. When it comes to activism, I think it's unrealistic to expect most people to be involved in local politics, right? Because again, even if people are involved in politics, a lot of people are going to be interested in national politics, or they're going to be involved in state level politics. So I think it's unrealistic to expect that you're going to get a wide swath of people to be showing up at a local community meeting to discuss parking in your neighborhood. Some people are really interested in that, but others aren't. So I think that we just need to accept the fact that when it comes to activism, you're always going to have some small group of activists who are largely unrepresentative of the majority participating there. Again, though, that's countered by the fact, hopefully, with elections, you can get most people voting in local elections, right? And that's...
Except they don't.
They don't,
that's
right,
kind
exactly.
Of my point, that
right, yes,
this
they
idea
don't.
that they're majoritarian opinions that are surfaced, I don't think that they are.
Right, they aren't. Right, no, and that's...
so,
and I argue...
how do you solve this constant small group of people being activists and only a small group of people voting? And that's not a majority either.
Right, if you look at local democracy, we don't have enough majoritarian influence, right? Largely because elections do a really poor job of that. Not just because people don't turn out, but there's also the other problems with elections. You've got gerrymandering, you've got, campaign finance challenges and all of that. So elections don't work really well as a majoritarian device. Ballot measures, direct democracy doesn't really work all that well as a majoritarian device because you need so much money to get things on the ballot and so forth. We need to think about other majoritarian devices for those issues that we wanted to be decided by the majority. I know a few months ago you had Helena Landemore on your podcast, and she has this idea about sortition in these autocratic assemblies of random groups of people coming together to make decisions. That's very majoritarian. Right?
Yes.
I mean, that is the idea that those random groups of people are going to represent the majority, and I think they do. So if you have an issue where you want majority rule, that's a really good way to get it. Now, we don't want that on all issues because it would actually undermine activism. Because if you think about it, there's no role for activists in those types of autocratic assemblies. But they can be good on some issues where we're like, okay, this is an issue where the majority, does care about the issue. They do have a specific preference they want. Let's do a autocratic assembly on that. So I think we need to think about different ways to have majoritarian influence on some issues, while on other issues allowing for activists to have sway over those.
So that, again, goes back to the idea of who determines, or how do we determine what's in the public interest, and then how to pursue those the best way, whether that's the activism or the majoritarian, autocratic, deliberative democracy way.
Right. And fundamentally, those are political questions that you can't argue by default. I think the real question you want to ask is, how do you set up the institutions in a way to either favor majoritarian preferences or favor activism? Because there's a lot of different things you can do with institutions, whether it be electoral reforms or doing autocratic assemblies or other sorts of things that can either favor activists or favor the majority. And we want to think about, how do we want to create those institutions? And then once the institutions are in place, then the process will play out and the public interest will be generated through activity through those institutions.
So what is the framework? What is the ideal institution, the way that you think about it?
Yeah, so you want to create institutions when you have a majority that cares about an issue and has a defined preference on that issue, that there should be institutions that allow the majority to actually act on that issue, right? So to give you a national example, think about abortion policy. Most people have a defined preference on that issue. They have the knowledge they need to have a defined preference, right? Large numbers of people really care about that issue. So to me, you want to create an institution that would allow for the majority to have a say on that issue. Now, whether that be a autocratic assembly or direct democracy or something along those lines. Now, we don't currently have that, right? And that's a real problem, is that we don't have those types of majoritarian institutions. But on other types of issues where the public may not really be clear about what they want, or maybe they care about the issue, but they really don't have the knowledge to come up with a coherent policy, we want institutions that allow activists to have influence. So, for example, the issue of more housing density in urban neighborhoods. People care about housing prices, right? That's a really important issue. It's a highly salient issue. But most people don't have a really clear idea of what they actually want government to do about it. And so on an issue like that, it doesn't seem like you'd want the majority to vote on a ballot initiative on that, because they don't even know what they really want. So on an issue like that, you want to create institutions that allow for activists to have influence, because these activists are likely to generate much better ideas and innovative ideas than the majority as a whole would actually do. And we've actually seen that with the YIMBY movement. And whether you agree or disagree with YIMBYs and what they argue, they've been very effective activists in California anyway, of getting government to implement certain policy changes. And I think that you wouldn't be able to do that if you had a strict majoritarian type of policymaking process.
Well, I will say that in New York City, housing advocates also are very effective. And there was a housing initiative ballot measure on the ballot in 2025 when we had a mayoral election. So we are a civic engagement podcast, and we celebrate every effort to strengthen civic life. And yet we're clearly still falling short of getting more residents to engage meaningfully. What is the gap in your mind in the current approach to get people to get more excited to get involved?
When I asked the activists I interviewed what was the thing they liked the least about participating, the thing that almost all of them said was that the incivility and hostility involved. And it really does scare a lot of people away. I asked them, well, are you on nextdoor.com? That's a social media site for neighborhoods and whatnot. Clearly a good venue for the people I was interviewing. They're like, oh no, too hostile, too uncivil. I won't engage on that. And I think that's a real problem for a lot of people who may be willing to participate, but they don't want to participate because of all the hostility and the anger that's out there. And when I talk to my students, they also mention that as well about, you just get yelled at if you try to involve in politics. And there was a lot of incivility, even among these activists at neighborhood meetings and in public meetings of city council and whatnot. So I think we need to really focus on the civility part of it and to be able to accept that reasonable people can disagree with you, which I actually found among the people I interviewed. Many of them wouldn't accept that. They wouldn't accept that the people on the other side had reasonable, legitimate arguments. They would say nice things about those people. They would say, yeah, so-and-so, he's a nice guy, but his arguments are totally nonsense. And if only I could convince him his arguments were nonsense, everything would be great. It's like, well, that's not how you want to approach politics, right? You have to approach it with the idea that reasonable people can disagree over issues. And I think we've lost that. And maybe I shouldn't say we've lost it, because maybe we've never really had it in this country, but we need to get to there. If you really want people involved, you need to convince them that if they participate, people will take their views seriously. They won't dismiss them. They won't yell at them, and they'll at least listen to their views, right? And I think we don't really have that.
For sure, we don't. But also, I think it's this really faulty frame that everybody engages in, or not everybody, but a lot of people engage in, that you need to persuade the other person, the other party to change their mind. And you're just never going to do that, actually. And I think if you enter any conversation with this mindset, it's going to be a terrible conversation. I have a question about what you would like everybody to know. Like, if you could get everyone, elected officials, residents, voters across America, to understand one thing about how local democracy actually works, what would it be?
That to really be an effective activist, if you really want to bring about change in your local communities, it's all about problem solving. It's about identifying a problem and figuring out innovative solutions. And we actually don't have a lot of good solutions to a lot of our problems. And people often assume that, of course, there's an obvious answer out there of, if only government would listen to the obvious answer, then everything would be fine, right? And there usually isn't an obvious answer. Now, granted, sometimes there is. There are some specific issues where, there'd be an obvious answer. Government's not doing it because of elite influence or whatever. But on most issues, there actually isn't a clear and obvious way to solve that issue, right? How do you solve the housing crisis in San Diego? Well, there's a lot of complexity there. And I think that the focus should be on developing those innovative solutions, not starting from the assumption that there's some obvious answer. If only elected officials would know the obvious answer, then everything will be solved.
Right. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've just shared with us into action?
Yeah, so many people, when they engage in politics, they do it after government does something they really don't like. Right. So government does something and they get really upset about, and this is particularly true on a local level, but also true nationally as well. They get really upset. They go to their city council meeting, they yell and scream, or they do other posts on social media or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with responding to what government does. But the most effective activism is when you're being proactive, when you're saying, okay, here's something about my community I want to change. And then you develop an innovative solution to fix that problem, and then you advocate for that solution. The bike lane example in San Diego is a really good example of that, right? These were, bike lane advocates who said, we want more bike lanes. They came up with proposals to do it, and they were able to convince the government to actually implement those proposals, right? So elected officials do want to solve problems. It's in their interest to solve problems. So when they run for re-election or run for higher office, they can say, look, I solved this problem. So if you can offer an elected official a solution to a problem that they're dealing with, they're going to be receptive to that. Now, granted, they have other influences. They may not want to solve problems because elites are telling them not to solve it or whatever. I don't want to say that elected officials are always responsive. But you're more likely to be effective if you are able to be proactive and positive and say, I've got a solution to a problem. Here's why I think is a good solution, and then advocate for that solution. And for the activists I interviewed that did that, they were much more successful, and they got a lot more out of it, right? I mean, it's just so much more of a positive experience to say, yeah, I helped solve this problem, than I yelled and screamed to stop government for doing something I don't like. That's the main thing I would argue for people who want to get involved in their communities, is start with a problem that you want to solve and then do the research and to really think through what could be an effective solution to that problem, and then advocate for that.
Yeah, well said. Good advice. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful? And I want to say specifically about local democracy.
I taught the Intro to American Government course this semester. So I had a group of freshmen and sophomores who were, 19 to 20-year-olds. And while their lack of knowledge was a bit striking and not so great, not very hopeful, they actually approached it in the right way. These young people in my class, they were willing to listen to views they disagreed with. They were willing to engage in conversations with people they disagreed with. They were willing to listen to the other side and be thoughtful. And it was really refreshing, because we often assume that generation, because they spend all their time on social media, that they're going to absorb all the practices of social media and be in that hostility and that incivility and all that. And I didn't see that at all among my students. So I'm hopeful that even though this generation spends so much time on social media, that they can separate out that very dysfunctional political discourse you see in that venue and in their real lives can actually engage in thoughtful deliberation and thoughtful discussion with people with whom they disagree.
Yeah, that is hopeful. Thank you so much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Bryan Adams is professor of political science at San Diego State University and the author of Activism, Majority Rule, and Local Democracy, Rethinking Public Influence. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. The most effective activism is proactivism. Don't wait to react to the impact of local government. Understand the problem in front of you, especially the issues you care about, and get engaged early. Speak to your elected officials and give them an opportunity to find a solution. It's win-win. Next week, we're joined by Samuel Moyn. He's the Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University, and his newest book is Gerontocracy in America: How the Old Are Hoarding Power and Wealth, and What to Do About It. That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And please do us a favor. While you're there, please leave us a review. It really goes a long way for other listeners to discover our show. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We are here to build your civic action toolkit every week, so follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, consider joining the Civics Club on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes every week, and it's a fantastic way to support the show. Go to patreon.com/futurehindsight now. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack, Travis, and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,